Hey, good day, folks. This is your hillbilly historian coming to you from the hills of East Tennessee, trying to bring you logic, truth, justice, the American way, and history you won't find in your textbooks, your high school or college textbooks. Today I'm going to talk about a guy I cannot believe his story is not in our history books. It is one of the most fabulous stories of American exceptionalism and achievement that I just, and there are so many in this country. It's just unreal. If you're willing to work hard, work smart, there's no limit to what you can do in this great United States of America. But anyway, I want to talk about a guy by the name of George Rogers Clark. I'm sure you've never heard of him. Yeah, now there's been a good book written about him, I think called Long Knives or something like that. The Indians referred to sword carrying soldiers as long knives, and their officers like to carry those long swords. But anyway, George Rogers Clark came from a family, Clark family in Western Virginia. They were farmers, rural people, but highly educated. They had private tutors, and they were taught in the principles of the Enlightenment. They were pro-American freedom, pro-revolution. George Rogers, I think, had an older brother that died in one of Britain's prisoner of war ships in the harbor of New York. Prisoner of war ships, and they were kept on board ship, and I think he died in one of those from illness and sickness. They weren't healthy places, prisoner of war camps back in them days. But anyway, you've heard of Lewis and Clark, the explorers who went across America, or the western part of America, after Thomas Jefferson purchased what's called the Louisiana Purchase, one of the greatest land grabs in history. But anyway, that was William Clark that went with Lewis, Meriwether Lewis, and went all the way across to the Pacific Ocean to let the British know that was going to belong to us, not them. And William was the younger brother to George Rogers Clark. William was also appointed governor of the Western Territory. His office was in St. Louis, Missouri, and he governed the entire western United States when it was a territory and hadn't started becoming states. But George Rogers Clark, he grew up there in Virginia, and when the Revolutionary War started, Benjamin Franklin called him to Philadelphia, had him come to Philadelphia, and said, "Look, we've got to protect our western flank from the British. I need you to take an army over the Appalachian Mountains and protect us from Indian attack, either defeat the Indians or work out agreements with them to where the British don't use the Indians and attack us from our vulnerable western flank." And George Rogers Clark agreed to it. Now, Franklin told him, said, "Now, whatever you need to buy, you just sign for it, and we'll take care of it." Yeah, boy. This is going to be a man who gives everything he owns to the U.S. government, the development of the United States of America. And boy, they screw the hell out of this poor guy. I mean, he is one of the greatest Americans of all time. And I guess that's why they don't want his story in the history books, because it shows how crooked our government can really be and how cruel toward its really great citizens that it can be. And George Rogers, he uh, he uh, uh, he agreed, and he went up to Fort Pitt, Pennsylvania, which later became Pittsburgh, where the rivers come together to form the Ohio River, which was the greatest road, path, avenue into the great Northwest of the United States. The Ohio River was formed, I think, from the Monongahela and another river or two there comes together at Pittsburgh, and they create a fort there called Fort Pitt. And Franklin told him there would be about 500 militiamen that would meet him there, and another 500 or 600 actual U.S. Army soldiers would meet him there. There would be about 4 or 5 companies back in them days of regular army, and then 5 companies of militia. Uh, about 100 men to the company back in those days. But anyway, he went, and there was no U.S. Army there for him to lead into the wilderness of the great Northwest, and there was only 167 militiamen. And these were really rough frontiersmen who volunteered for this job. And George Rogers Clark had a rough time with them. He had to whoop a couple of them, physically whoop them, to get them all in line, to get them to obey his orders and everything. Uh, and he led them down the Ohio River. Now the British had a fort in what is today Cincinnati area, and George Rogers Clark tricked them into thinking he had a lot more men than he really did, and darn if they didn't surrender. I think what he did was he captured one of their Indians and marched him out in front of the fort and beheaded him right there. And that just scared the holy crap out of the British in that fort. And they surrendered. You know, if I'd seen somebody cut somebody's head off, I wouldn't surrender to them. I'd fight to the death. But, hey, they gave up. So George Rogers Clark tricked the British into giving up this fort there in Cincinnati. And then the British, he let them go, and they went on up to Detroit. And George Rogers Clark marched some of his men on westward into southern Illinois area. I think it was called Vincennes, and it was just above St. Louis, which was controlled by the Spanish at that time. And he actually took another fort there from the British at Vincennes, and he worked out agreements with these Indians. He really didn't have to fight them that much. They just had so much respect for George Rogers Clark that they worked out agreements. They signed agreements, treaties with him that they would not attack the United States from the west. And while he was in Vincennes, he got word the British were heading down to Cincinnati to take their fort back. And he didn't have but just a handful of men left there to protect it. So he and his men there in Vincennes ran on foot all the way to what is now Cincinnati. And they didn't have highways, interstates, or bridges, or anything. So when they came to a river that fed into the Ohio River, they had to go up river for a while to cross it, find a place shallow enough to cross it, and then back down to the Ohio River and run up the river. But they got there in time, and they were able to stiffen resistance against the British and defeat the British one more time. And the British were using the Shawnee Indians in that area to fight on their side, but most of the Shawnees were down in Kentucky trying to wipe out Boonesboro, Daniel Boone and his fort down there, and Daniel Boone was outnumbered 7 or 8 to 1 down there, and he was kicking their butt over and over and over again. And but up there at Cincinnati, old George Rogers Clark and his men kicked the British, because I think if the British had defeated Clark there, they would have went down and helped the Shawnees against Boone and Boonesboro. And with cannon, they would have been able to knock down Daniel Boone's fort there at Boonesboro and drive them out of Kentucky back across the Appalachian Mountains. And then the American Revolution would have been vulnerable from the west. But George Rogers Clark and Daniel Boone both did their job and defeated their opponents. And George Rogers Clark defeated the British once again. And then he headed back to Illinois, and then there was another threat that the British were coming down for another attack. This was in the middle of the winter. The rivers had flooded, and George Rogers Clark and his men waded across southern Indiana where the Wabash River had overflowed its banks in waist and chest deep water, and at night they would try to find an island where they could stay above water and get some sleep, and then get to wading the very next morning in this ice cold water for days. And they got there in time to stop and defeat the British once again. And George Rogers Clark and his men said that after that trip across the flooded plains of southern Indiana, that they never got warm again for the rest of their lives. They just never could get warm ever again. It just they were just chilled so deeply into their bones and everything that they just couldn't get warm ever again. But anyway, George Rogers Clark did all this, kept the Indians peaceful, prevented the British and the Shawnee from taking, Daniel Boone prevented Shawnee from taking Boonesboro, and George Rogers Clark defeated the British several times, took forts away from them, defended those forts, maintained them until the Treaty of Paris, when the British finally gave America their independence. And I think that occurred in 1783. But George Rogers Clark defended that western frontier for about 7 or 8 years with 167 men. Now get this. George Rogers Clark did not lose a single man. He, if he had any wounded, they were healed. Nobody died under his command. He was able to pretty much single-handedly stop the British cold in the Northwest Territory during the American Revolution, protect the western flank from British invasion and interference, and helped the United States win its independence. George Rogers Clark, a name you should never, never forget. I mean, he practically defeated everything the British had and never lost a single soul. Amazing feat performed by this man. Now he had to sign for almost everything he bought. And at the end of the war, when he tried to get the government to pay their bills, they claimed that they had never received any of those invoices. And they denied owing any money or anything or ever having promised George Rogers Clark that they'd pay his bills. They just basically turned their back on him after what he had done for them. And he basically was screwed, totally screwed, because all those vendors that had sold him stuff to feed his army, to arm and feed his army. You know, they needed boats sometimes, they needed food, they needed ammunition and powder, and every time he signed for it, the rest of his life, if he accumulated anything, he got sued. His vendors sued him for the rest of his life for that money he signed for that Benjamin Franklin had promised the government would pay it, and the government didn't. Now, what's also interesting about this, that entire box of invoices where George Rogers Clark had been sending invoices to Washington, D.C. for 7 or 8 years to pay his bills, they just stuck them in a box and they hid them in the attic of one of the government buildings there in D.C. I think it was in 1905 that box of invoices was discovered. Well, by then, George Rogers Clark and all his men had passed away. All the people, the vendors had passed away, you know, and the government had beat all these people out of their money. Of course, they sued George Rogers Clark every time he had $1 that they could sue for. So he was penniless his entire life because of what the government did to him, and the vendors coming after their money because he signed for it, so he was legally responsible, and he didn't have a contract or anything with the U.S. government that they would pay these bills. He failed to get a signed document from the government. So that's a moral you need to learn. Never, never deal with the U.S. government without a signed document, and make sure you dot all the I's and cross all the T's, because they will screw you in a heartbeat. And they've been known to steal software from software companies, all kinds of things they do. It's just unbelievably unreal. They just think they can get away with everything, and they do most of the time. But poor old George Rogers Clark performed one of the greatest feats for American development and history in our entire American history, and the government just screwed the holy crap out of him. You know, blacks talk about reparations. There's a few white folks out there that got screwed a lot worse than they did, you know, but because they were given 40 acres and a mule, and plus with Johnson's war on poverty, they've been given reparations to the tune of about 23 trillion already, and they want more. But the Clark family, you don't hear a word out of them. You know, they should collect on George Rogers Clark's debt with interest, but they don't. They were a hard-working family, and they're doing. All the Clarks are doing well in this country, and but anyway, George Rogers Clark. You know, I was in my business my early days. I had to drive up through Kentucky quite a bit, And there was a shortcut into eastern Kentucky. I could take a road from Richmond up to Winchester. And on that road, there was a George Rogers Clark High School. And I was so proud of the fact that somebody had acknowledged his greatness and named a high school. Now, in Leslie County, there's their high school is the Richard Milhouse Nixon High School when you go up through there in Hyden, Kentucky. But there, near Winchester, there's the George Rogers Clark High School. I was so proud to drive by that school and know that George Rogers Clark had been recognized by somebody for his greatness and his contribution to our liberty and freedom, our independence. He was just a marvelous, marvelous frontiersman and did a great job for this country. You know, he had a leg injury and he had to have a leg amputated. And one of the Indians, they all admired him so much, these Indians came to where this surgery was being done, and one of those Indians stole his leg after it was amputated. I mean, that's how much they admired and respected him. This one Indian wanted that leg for a souvenir because he admired George Rogers Clark to the extent that that he was he wanted that leg as a souvenir or remembrance of a man he greatly admired. And George Rogers Clark survived the amputation and lived for many years, but he was always penniless and broke because if he ever started a business or tried to earn anything, he'd get sued by those vendors that he signed for. But in 1905, they found a box of every one of those invoices that George Rogers Clark had sent back to the government. They found them in a box in the attic of one of the federal buildings there in Washington, D.C. I think that was around 1905. Yeah, I mean, that was amazing that they even hid the invoices. Denied they had them and hid them. Jesus Christ. See what you have to deal with in government sometimes? I think we go to war against the wrong people. You know, we ought to go to war against Washington, D.C. They're the ones that screw us all the time. But anyway, this is your hillbilly historian enlightening you about a man you'll never read about in your high school or college history textbooks, a man by the name of George Rogers Clark, who with 167 men crossed the Appalachian Mountains, went into the Northwest Territory, kept all the Indians peaceful, defeated the British over and over and over again, and never lost a single man, not one casualty. Boy, now there's the kind of generalship we need in every war that can do marvelous feats as George Rogers Clark did. And his little brother went with Meriwether Lewis, and they explored the great Northwest. Great, great American family, the Clarks. And so, folks, this is your hillbilly historian bringing you history you don't find in your college or high school history books. Signing off from the hills of East Tennessee here in Appalachia. You have a good one.